Today here we have a very important guest. His name is Mark Grassman. He's with Cybersecurity Practice Principal. He works overseas with a team of strategy and solution advisors in cybersecurity at Alchemy Technology Group. With over 15 years of experience, he helps companies nationwide enhance their operations and security measures. Can we please give him a hand, y'all?
Brandon. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that as well. So, welcome everybody. Come in, fill in, grab a spot. So as Brandon mentioned, Mark Grassman, help lead a team of individuals that help organizations here locally, but also all over the country, through their cyber journey, specifically helping by advising on strategy that at the end of the day helps cyber be a first-class citizen in the organization's priorities as organizations transform themselves by modernizing IT operations, building applications, and just trying to address the needs and threats of the 21st century. Today we're going to be talking on the topic of zero trust, and there's a lot of different folks in the room that are maybe at different levels of knowledge on the topic or in different points of the journey in their organization. This is meant to be more of a high-level conversation of the strategy, methodology, and execution of zero trust, not a 201 or 301 in deep aspects of it, micro-segmentation, advanced policy orchestration. We get into that, but again, most organizations that are starting their journey really at the end of the day are still trying to understand the vision that is necessary to execute this overall methodology. So we're going to talk about what's driving the need for this and why more organizations are aligning to this methodology and strategy. Specifically talk through some of the prescriptive frameworks that exist. Talk about just some of the architecture that you may or may not have in your organizations to execute on this strategy. And then specifically, we're going to talk about things that I've seen that make organizations successful in this journey, and some things that absolutely will set them back or trip them up, in the journey. And then we'll, spend some time if there's some questions and dig into a little bit of that, or if anybody wants to share a little bit of their journey as well. All right. So zero trust today. There we go. Obligatory definition slide. So for anybody that is in the room that doesn't understand, never trust, always verify. These are core principles of zero trust. Again, as most organizations started building their IT operations infrastructure 25, 30, 35 years ago, it was all focused on just making things work, making things talk. Wasn't specifically in the concept of zero trust and least privilege. Obviously, as organizations connected themselves to the internet, as well as connected themselves to business partners, having a need to potentially enforce trust between those entities became apparent, but still organizations have struggled on what that execution potentially looks like. So why is zero trust in aligning to this potential methodology? Because I think everybody can agree principles of least privilege, sounds good. Why aren't we doing that? Again, it didn't happen in a bubble, specifically. IT over the last 30 years has built themselves out in layers, sometimes referred to as siloed. The network team's doing their thing, the server team, storage team's doing their thing, the application teams are doing their their own thing. App dev, be it today's modern incantation of that with DevOps or historic app dev, they're doing their own thing, and really nobody's kind of dancing together. It's also historically legacy technology that was never really meant to interrupt with each other in some type of orchestrated way. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The infrastructure automation. So again, when the network doesn't specifically have the capability to talk to an identity provider or doesn't have an ability to talk to some other orchestration and automation engine in an environment, how can you ever expect to have a dynamic environment that can, on a dime, change the interaction with how data travels across the network or how an application is accessed? So again, the silos, and because there was a lack of automation capabilities between these disparate technologies as they were built out, really make Zero Trust more difficult. We'll talk more on that subject. And then specifically in the network layer, most organizations over the last 35 years have built the network purely for availability, getting the packets from one place to another, getting one system to talk to each other, and typically done so with a level of rigor that wasn't understood what really truly needed to go across the wire versus just letting everything go across the wire. So most environments we walk into are open routed networks. Very few organizations have additional points implemented where there could be advanced policy enforcement or even just traffic analytics being performed to understand what is going across these networks. It's essentially highways without state troopers, without traffic cameras, without stoplights. But that's how it was built, and that's what makes this whole concept a little bit more challenging to execute on. So why are businesses aligning to this? You may or may not, depending on how strategic IT and security operations is to the businesses in which you operate in, and align to their business and revenue generating opportunities. These goals may or may not align, but most organizations realize they need to mature their security posture, that there's enough of a risk now to their availability via some type of outage or to the integrity of their systems of the data for this to potentially be a business level priority. It's been exacerbated as the perimeter of an organization's network has been extended, especially for a lot of organizations for the first time in the last 5-6 years because of the folks that had to go work remotely, and for organizations that still choose to allow the flexibility of remote work. This really was a struggle for certain organizations like Google over 10 years ago, and really drove their paradigm shift from a perimeter-based network approach, to a zero trust model. We'll talk about that. Obviously, organizations are, concerned to the risk of their operations. So again, when you can go from a factory directly all the way back to a data center or potentially another business partner because there's very little access control between those various business segments, if that's exploited and taken advantage of, that can really cause issues to the business, the relationships you have, or the integrity or availability of the business's operations. And then lastly, it's kind of the old analogy, you protect the crown jewels, but most organizations don't have proper protections in place around their crown jewels, which at the end of the day is the data. What your organization produces, what it makes intelligent business decisions off of, that is valuable to the organization, as well as threat actors that choose to interrupt the availability or the confidentiality and integrity of those systems and data. So a zero trust approach is absolutely necessary to execute on that guard your crown jewels methodology. Zero trust is the best way to execute on it. So what are we talking about when we talk about zero trust? I've touched upon a number of these principles already, but specifically, number one, most important, constantly and explicitly verify, as well as access of devices, users, accessing resources, and that's something that has to be done continuously. Just because you were MFA'd and you're allowed access to a network or a system doesn't mean 5 minutes later that access should continue to be allowed. There could have been a change in your posture. You could have potentially changed the networks in which you're accessing from. All of these types of pieces of context lead into intelligent zero trust access control decisions that should define your relationship of how end users and devices access resources. Least privilege. Most organizations, again, have not built their infrastructures, either network or data systems or applications, on the concept of least privilege. So it's very difficult for them to enforce that methodology if they're not practicing it within the individual silos or the individual applications. How many of your organizations do end users have access to a lot more out in the file servers and file sharers than they probably necessarily need for their business function? How many of you have defined all the roles that exist in an organization and the entitlement in which those roles should have in every application that exists in your organization? These are principal elements of least privilege that, again, most organizations haven't gone through. So how can you expect to have an orchestrated and automated access control methodology when you don't have, the information to properly feed the automation defined in the first place? And then lastly, assume breach. So most organizations and cyber leaders have started moving to this model of understanding that you can't keep everything out. So what do we do to protect the integrity, confidentiality, and integrity of our systems if somebody has some type of privileged access in the environment? That historically was our zero trust perimeter. So doing more advanced monitoring of what end users are doing, what they are accessing, sometimes even referred to as user entity behavioral analytics, is important because, again, any person, any identity, any device potentially can become your adversary. So again, following kind of these basic tenets are very important for the execution of a zero trust strategy. So let's talk about frameworks and something a little more prescriptive than philosophical here. So zero trust isn't new by any means. Some of you might be surprised how far back the execution of this actually goes. Way back with the Jericho Forum, 20 years ago now. Again, kind of a standards group got together, a bunch of CISOs, trying to understand, now that their organizations were connecting to the internet, how they were going to handle this exchange between business partners, the internet, and their organization, because their trust perimeter really was being extended. So really, for the first time, some standards and intellectual thought was put into it. Back in 2009, there's a gentleman that later kind of became an evangelist at some the manufacturers that later became leaders in zero trust architecture, coined the term zero trust for one of the advisory organizations, Forrester, and really started to kind of light a fire from an industry standpoint towards this principle. 2014, Google executes on their BeyondCorp strategy. They entirely eliminated VPNs over 10 years ago at Google. Everybody uses identity to access any Google resource anywhere in the world, including their data centers. Again, Google had such a scale that traditional IT operations and cyber operations principles just couldn't fit. You think about other innovations Google has had with scalable storage. They couldn't buy enough SANs to store all the world's internet information, so they literally had to invent a technology that now is leveraged by every hyperscaler out there, as well as other methodologies of scaling IT operations. They did so by executing on a zero trust strategy focused around identity and identity-centric, and published a lot of information around it, which then led a couple of years later a lot of the manufacturers to realize they needed to up their game, really started adhering to these strategies. And we'll talk about it from a technology tool standpoint, because there's no single vendor, no single tool that exists to execute on this strategy completely. But people started to, listen, kind of play off the same sheet of music per se, really about 10 years ago, and that's informed some of the strategies and journeys some of you may be on. Later on, Forrester and Gartner got into it, for good or bad, folks that listen to the advisory and analyst organizations. Both of them tried to provide a prescriptive methodology, at least from, a high-level strategy of how to execute on this across all of the different disparate technologies in principle. And some organizations have used that to inform their journey. But more recently, and we'll talk briefly about this, there's even more prescriptive recommendations as well as maturity matrices that are being developed or have been developed by government standards bodies, NIST and CISA specifically, that in our opinion really help inform organizations of more tactical things they can do to execute on this strategy. 800-207, the original, I think it's 59 pages in the white paper. You'll see a couple of diagrams from that white paper talk more tactically about what components are necessary to drive zero trust architecture and the overall strategy of zero trust. More recently, and it's in the process of being finalized, they just pulled it from public comment here this week. The 1835 actually is even more prescriptive methodology from the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. If folks didn't realize that existed, it actually does. And what NIST did is actually work with most of the leading industry manufacturers and align their tools and technology directly to zero trust methodology and architecture. There's hundreds, thousands of pages of their testing acumen and validation and configuration guides for this stuff. Definitely something to look into. And if they share this prezo out, these are all hyperlinked. And then for organizations trying to understand where you're at in your journey, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. CISA had published a couple of years ago very good guidance that helps you kind of understand if you're just starting, where you're at, how do you achieve more advanced and optimal levels. But in a very simple way, by just kind of asking you questions where you're at in your journey across the 5 major pillars of what they perceive zero trust is, which is your identity, your data, your application workloads, your network infrastructure, infrastructure in general, as well as your governance strategies, how you're monitoring across all of those silos or technology pillars. Specifically. So that's a really great guide and something that guides our advisory practice for the assessments we do of organizations, understanding where they're at today and do gap analysis on their zero trust architecture and journey. So definitely recommend taking a look at that. So let's talk about this architecture a little bit for the folks in the room that haven't specifically seen this or maybe employing a tool but don't realize it actually harkens back to a specific and prescriptive architecture. So real simply, zero trust architecture is foundational in the understanding that you need to have something in between, whoever is accessing a resource. So this may be a device, it may be a user on a device. But a lot of us have devices that may per se not have so much a user on it anymore if you think about OT and IoT systems, for example. And a lot of this methodology applies to OT infrastructure as well as enterprise IT infrastructure with some very prescriptive differences with OT because there's even more hyper concern around availability and potentially integrity, safety, of systems operating. But at the end of the day, some type of policy decision point, policy enforcement point, PDP, sits between that user traffic to help make access control decisions. This is really a core tenet of zero trust, sometimes also referred to as software-defined perimeter. This is a blown-out version of it where you separate really the policy enforcement point and that policy decision point. This is your control plane and data plane. So for people in the network realm, this is very common where you have your separate planes for traffic as well as the control of traffic, but this also exists for other IT infrastructure operations models. But you can see around the outside of it, you can't make policy decisions in a silo. So what makes zero trust in this particular architecture so effective is you get all of this context information about the state of the user, about the state of the device, things that inform trust and are used in that access control decision originally and continuously as it is operating and accessing a resource. This might be data, the internet, an application. So having other systems that have an ability to interrupt and share information. These are typically modern infrastructures, things with APIs. For the most stuff, cloud hosted or cloud native tools and services. It's super important, as well as how that feeds into your security operations from a monitoring SIM and SOC standpoint. And potentially gets orchestrated back. If you detect something, wouldn't it be great if I could, talk to a policy, a policy enforcement point and block, that system, from having access. This is yet another blown out version of it that breaks in. I know it's a little bit difficult to see with the lights, but identities and endpoints going through some type of zero trust policy enforcement point, again, fed information from a threat protection infrastructure. Again, this might be threat intel, it might be information from the endpoint. Doesn't really matter, it's just making more intelligent decisions based on context that it is fed. And again, that might be not going over a traditional private network, it might be just accessing it over the web. Again, you authenticate and hit your SaaS application, well, where's my PDP? I'm not having, I don't control that network that it operates on. Where's my PEP there? Well, that's your identity provider in those regards. Organizations that have implemented SSO and MFA, you haven't even realized you've already started your zero trust journey, but you're typically not, those identity teams doing it in a silo aren't typically working, with the endpoint teams to maybe bring device context into that, or the application teams to bring other telemetry into the decision. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But this, again, for folks, I'm just kind of curious in the room, how many people are already familiar with this kind of policy decision, policy enforcement point, understanding methodology? Okay, about half, okay. All right, so what we're all here for, what should you do, what shouldn't you do? And again, somewhat subjective, but I've had the luxury over the last nearly 20 years in the business, working with thousands of organizations, regulated, non-regulated, kind of everything in between, manufacturing, to highly sophisticated defense contractors and aerospace companies. There's some stuff I've seen, that do a good job in others. First of all, understanding where you're at in your journey. As I mentioned, follow the CISA maturity model guidance. If you haven't assessed or gap analyzed your organization, you don't know where you're going until you know where you are coming from, and also understand that this is a journey. You get on this train, you don't get off. You don't just, hey, we're gonna do zero trust, next quarter, and then after that, we're just gonna kind of go back to how we used to do everything. Fourth, prescriptive things, and we'll kind of run through this, specifically. Bringing people together, new architecture paradigm, analytics, and keep it simple, stupid. So first and foremost, what I see constantly is the biggest challenge of executing on this strategy is you don't have everybody working together, singing off the same sheet of music. IT operations is over here. I got a separate identity team. I got a separate network team. I got a separate cyber operations team. I got a separate app team. Oh, and I got DBAs, and they don't talk to anybody. At the end of the day, this is a shared collective problem to the organization. So doing the work, getting everybody in the same tent, doing the group therapy, whatever you want to call it, if everybody isn't playing from the same sheet of music, it's going to sound like trash. So first of all, everybody needs to agree that you need to be using modern tools that have modern control planes with those APIs so their silos can share information with other silos. If you don't have that, how are you supposed, how are you hoping to execute? You don't execute zero trust manually. You have to use automation and robots for this. Threat actors are using robots. We need to use robots and automation. If you're not fighting robots with robots, we've all seen that movie. It doesn't turn out well. Identity, again, as I mentioned, a lot of you may have started on this journey already by implementing SSO and MFA. A lot of those are more modern infrastructures, so that's great. But again, if that identity team is doing that in a silo, they're integral to everything and everything every other operations team and everything zero trust, they got to lead by example and really do the reaching out. Endpoint teams, network teams, and the cyber operations folks. You all got to start working together towards this integrated outcome. The new paradigm. So without implementing the technology, having those policy enforcement points, be the identity provider. On a network, it may be some new zero trust exchange. It may be a firewall. It may be implementing layer 4, layer 7 security further down in your local area network. Maybe using more certificate-based infrastructure. All of these things are important. Without this new technology, this new architecture paradigm, you can't achieve zero trust other than in respective silos. So again, we're talking about everybody working together, everybody's singing off the same sheet of music, but you do need some instruments that need to be part of every performance. Analytics, why, even though we agree, we got some of the tools, but we're too scared to implement some of these things. Data's flowing right now, systems are working, I'm afraid to start locking down stuff. What do I turn off, because I don't know, I go to the app owners, they can't tell me what protocols the app is using. They don't know what it's talking to on the network, or if it's even using the network in the first place. Analytics are the friend of, modern cyber operations, but every IT operations team to be able to work towards this collective outcome of zero trust. So a lot of times this comes as part of more modern infrastructure. Legacy infrastructure, this is something that typically has to be bolted on. Think about span and tap on traditional local area network and wide area network, advanced firewall analytics, depending on where you have firewalls in your layer 3 through 7 boundaries. All of this needs to go somewhere. It needs to be ingested, analyzed, and hopefully maybe used to facilitate automation. Imagine, you could just enforce firewall policies by understanding everything that's been going through the firewall for the last 30 days. Let's just block everything else except what we know is good traffic. That's potentially a place to start. That's a more scary place to start. So one of the other paradigms is, kind of taking another approach that's a little less scary, a little less potentially impactful, but again, getting people familiar and comfortable with the journey. As I mentioned, you need this information to understand what's going on, and it needs to be able to connect into those policy enforcement points. Again, analytics on its own without automation is just data. So that's how I see organizations actioning on it. And then, as I mentioned, keeping it simple. Most people want to look at addressing the biggest risk initially, but it's the biggest, mountain to climb, which is your internal network-based segmentation. What I've seen the most success getting with organizations starting to execute on this methodology is really starting from the outside in. Let's eliminate some of the things that are also very risky that don't contribute to zero trust principle, like VPNs, for example. Most organizations haven't done the internal network segmentation, so a VPN is essentially just allowing remote access in an unchecked way to allow a threat actor to get anywhere in the environment, really extending that perimeter. That's a perfect place to potentially start. That isn't as complicated and isn't as, can be super impactful from a cyber standpoint, but maybe not be as impactful from the operations of the organization, and kind of keep working that way in. Why do we have potentially firewall policies distributed everywhere and hopefully orchestrated, but in a lot of cases still manually managed across a large distributed wide area network? Why don't we have all of that just coming to one central location and one place to manage that policy enforcement? We'll start just doing that for internet. So now we have remote access. Now we got internet applying, conforming to zero trust principles. Hey, we're starting to cook with gas here a little bit. So again, keeping it simple and kind of starting from that outside in approach is what I've seen most successful for a lot of organizations. All right, we've got a few minutes left here, and I wanted to give some time, for some conversation questions here as well. What are the things you should not do, or will trip you up in the start or part of the continuous journey that you'll find yourselves on? Not a single product, and identity. So, despite what you may see in marketecture and what some folks may understand about their own technology that they resell or implement, there is no single tool. There's also really no single vendor solution, even though there's a lot of them that continue to build out very, very large portfolios that cover a significant portion of Zero Trust. But this is a collective outcome of technology that is necessary to execute on Zero Trust architecture and Zero Trust methodology. Again, aligning to the principles that these need to be modern solutions that have APIs, that may already have predefined integrations. That's what good looks like. Not, hey, this is the best tool for doing this thing and it doesn't talk to anything else, which is, again, what the prescription has been for the last 25 years. So this, more than anything else, again, a lot of people buy in to strategies because they haven't defined them themselves, because it looks like the easy button, potentially. However, I've seen too many organizations go down this path and are limited. You find yourself, yes, they can execute on a lot of capabilities. They got identity, they got application, they got data, but they don't have the network. And I'm sorry, network and network security is very important for certain systems that don't align to the methodology of identity or modern application. It is your last line of security control, in some cases your first line of security control. So again, it's typically a multi-vendor collection that is necessary to execute on this architecture. And if you go back to that newer NIST framework from the National Center of Excellence, that's what they show. They're bringing together a collection of vendors to, again, drive to this outcome because there is no single vendor portfolio that currently exists. Second thing, and we see this over and over again, so at Alchemy, we're kind of known as the identity people. It's where we really started in cybersecurity and where we've potentially worked with a number of the organizations in the room here, helping them define identity security, what that roadmap and strategy should consist of across identity access management, identity governance administration, privilege access management, and identity threat detection and response. If you don't have identity tackled, understood, and matured, it is very difficult to execute on the rest of Zero Trust because your identity is at the center of every access control decision. That identity needs to be automated. Based on what group you're in, that gives you the ability to access this part of the network or this application or this data set. Well, if that group membership is manually assigned when somebody is hired and may or may not be changed when they move in the organization and may not be disabled when they leave the organization, you fall down very, very quickly. Most organizations don't have true automation or organization set up in their identity infrastructure. So they have identity sprawl. You need to organize it. You need to get that agreement of who does what in the organization, what they should have access to, the type of access they should have, and when and where that should be restricted. These are not decisions you should make as individual practitioners. These are business decisions. Honestly, this stuff needs to be defined by HR. They're the best to actually control it at the end of the day. Not an email to you that, hey, somebody's leaving or somebody got hired or somebody's moving, the organization. You build that foundation, you can now use identity automation, identity governance administration, principles to make better access control decisions in an automated way, in a dynamic way, continuously. Without that, again, you're going and making manual changes to firewall policies based off of group memberships, and if those group memberships aren't automated, again, you can kind of see where the whole thing snowballs from an inefficiency standpoint. And then at the end of the day, this whole idea of adaptive authentication, just because you are authorized 5 minutes ago doesn't mean that you should be authorized now. Something may have changed. Again, you might have switched network segments. Very common tactic of threat actors. Steal an MFA token on one network, jump onto another network and try to execute a now privileged access request that didn't have that network context, and you're allowed to use whatever rigs and vehicles you have set up to potentially do a quick little pen test or network map of the environment to execute further outcomes. again, that information needs to be continuously monitored and validated so you can inform an access control decision at any point in time in the session. You have to have a mature identity strategy to be able to execute on that, to then be able to share that level of intelligence and automation with other infrastructures in your environment, be it the application owners and the app infrastructure, be it the network infrastructure, et cetera. There's some specific guidance and things, if organizations haven't done an assessment of their identity infrastructure, their maturity there, again, there's defined frameworks just around those principles. So with that, kind of just shared a few best practices, a few of the things that we've seen been successful, a few things that we've seen hang up organizations towards this journey. Again, it's meant to be an introduction to the topic, as well as kind of what we see success and what good looks like. With that, I know we have a few minutes left in the session here. If there's any specific questions, if anybody is interested in kind of sharing where they may be at in the journey, if other folks, you're proud of it, to share with the collective community here. Brandon's got a microphone, so he's happy to go up and let you kind of speak amongst your peers. Any specific questions or thoughts? Yep.
Super easy.
Yep.
Anybody can do that in 3 seconds.
Yep.
What is your tip for
private applications?
For handling the on-prem apps?
Yes.
What's the maybe a basic process for evaluating?
Yep.
Maybe the human part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So his question is, again, we've started the journey with SaaS apps. We were able to put those behind an identity provider that acts as my policy decision, policy enforcement point to those SaaS apps. But how do I do it for private hosted apps? Most organizations have private hosted apps in a relatively less sophisticated data center. A lot of times there's flat network segments. There may be multiple VLANs, but you're not even doing any policy enforcement between VLANs, because everything in the data center can talk to everything in the data center. I want that app to talk to that SQL server. When they did the migration from the old SQL server to the new SQL server, I just kept it open so that things could continue to talk. So how do you potentially move those apps into a zero trust model like this? As I mentioned initially, analytics are going to be your friend. So typically within a data center, most organizations I see don't have proper network analytics in place that help them understand what apps are talking to what apps, if they're even talking to the internet. A lot of times all you have for analytics there is in your north-south boundary, the firewall leaving the organization, and even to the extent that you're logging and analyzing that, not from a SIM perspective for specific threat detection, but actually from a traffic analysis standpoint. There's a bunch of vendors and tools just around NTA, network traffic analysis, and then also for some of those vendors offer network detection and response capabilities. So it's a twofold benefit, both for IT operations and app owners to understand what's talking to what, and for security operations folks from an NDR standpoint to get more information, especially for east-west traffic, of what might be suspicious rather than just stuff leaving the perimeter firewall. With that information, you can then start doing network segmentation. But it all goes back to not only what are the applications doing, but who is communicating with the application. What devices on the local area network, the wireless network, are there users tied to those devices? So you also need another level of network telemetry if you're not getting that information from your identity provider, if it's not hybrid in nature, because again, you may use a different identity on premises if that legacy private hosted application was tied to Active Directory, but a lot of those aren't. So now, I'm dealing with identity that's not part of any central system. How the hell do I ever figure all that out? So analytics are important, both in the data center, but equally important out in the perimeter. And again, as I mentioned, working from the outside in, there's lots of tools you can implement that are on the endpoints, out in the local area networks, at the user device, at the perimeter, or outside the perimeter, as well as when they're working inside the perimeter, that can provide you that information. And that analytics is actually built into those zero trust architectures, sometimes referred to as SSE or Secure Services Edge products. You bring all of that together, And then you need to decide where you're going to do your policy enforcement. Is it in the data center? Is it closer to the endpoint? Is it at the wide area network at the segments in between? You got to figure out how to bring that security from the outside further into the organization. But again, without having that data, it's really hard to just go and do that. Some just implement the firewalls, or some of these policy enforcement points, turn them on, and they hope they collect enough information at that point. But again, you don't get all the visibility. You also need to see what's going on at the resource as well as at the requester level and bring all three together. That's what I've seen what good looks like. Any other questions?
Can you hear me, Greg?
Yep.
So on the zero trust circle, all the solutions
Yeah.
in enterprise browser,
Yeah.
is that more for posture assessment or policy enforcement or both?
Yeah. So enterprise browser is interesting. Really seen it gotten popular in the last couple of years. Certain industries initially, and then a little bit more wider adoption. When you can't verify or confirm the integrity or the security of an endpoint, or the opposite side, you don't want to allow the execution of something on a trusted endpoint. The fourth, and if you go into that NIST 100-207, they have 4 different models of zero trust. There's an agent, perimeter model. There's some other ones that align more to SSE, and there's like an SSL portal, just like a web portal model. Very, very common for BYOD. But there's a 4th model a lot of people really haven't given much credence to, which is the app sandboxing or the secure enclave model, where again, you're executing something that is not given any implicit trust to the endpoint in which you're executing on. So there are certain things like the internet that you may never want to give any trust to, even on a trusted endpoint in your environment. When you browse out to an application or a website that's not part of the corporate catalog, and this is general internet browsing, or a SaaS app that isn't registered, has never been seen by the organization, why do you want that app to execute in a browser that is given a level of trust in the environment? This is what threat actors are taking advantage of now, to harvest credentials and tokens from browser sessions, circumvent the browser security themselves. A lot of people have seen certain browsers have literally weekly security patches now, which is pretty ridiculous. So the idea of doing zero trust at that tactical level, that's typically where we see enterprise browsers being executed. Some of that happens with software deployed on individual endpoints. Some of this happens with network vendors that are in that network session and just execute those types of requests within an isolated browser, sometimes local, sometimes as part of hosted infrastructure. But secure enclaves, app sandboxing, enterprise browser, whatever you want to call it, this is a relevant form of zero trust when those other kind of zero trust controls aren't as relevant. Yeah, so microsegmentation is interesting too. So where do we see that play in? Microseg I typically see in the data center and to some extent more recently on the endpoint. So this typically is utilizing an agent or something built into the endpoint itself to make the endpoint the policy enforcement point. Some of those solutions will gather that information of what is coming and going from that endpoint up to those clouds. That's where the analytics are coming from, and then can have policy decisions executed off of that. It's kind of been sold as the single kind of silver bullet for zero trust. It really started getting popular about 16, 17. There's a few vendors that specifically, have been in that space. Some have been recently acquired. It goes back to the other question. It's just one form of visibility. Identifying the user and the device that's accessing that data, they may not always have that information or clarity because, again, they don't have as much visibility on that initial resource requester. They are typically executed on the device that is the resource itself that is being accessed, but you can't just install agents on certain types of resources. Think about infrastructure NAS systems or other non-Windows or Linux server systems. So it can go a long way to help execute a form, especially of internal zero trust, quickly, but it's by far not a universal strategy. And again, that's kind of the point. That's why there's 4 different models from a zero trust architecture standpoint. That's why even in the prescriptive framework recommendations, they're not able to do it with single vendor. Also, identity is harvested from multiple resources, which is more difficult to facilitate identity automation when you're orchestrating now across multiple identity providers. So there's a few things that kind of break down in the model, but it is another relevant tool and very, very common in software-defined networking as well with public cloud infrastructure. That ability is actually built in, whereas legacy networks, data center cores, things like that, until recently with certain vendors, hasn't been something built into that infrastructure. Any other questions? Anything else to share? Any specific things that have been helpful? Maybe getting your businesses to align to this methodology that might be beneficial to share with the group?
So, on the infrastructure side,
Yeah.
right? We have what we call a high impact data center,
Yeah.
and everything that is there, part of onboarding, every system and application, we must have a justification for every service
Yep.
and board that are running on that.
You have a secure enclave, so everything in there is so business critical that any type of access needs to go through all of these additional steps. But all of that is probably manual today as far as onboarding and the methodology. So you have the methodology there, but what you're missing is the execution from an automation standpoint that would make it, where you don't need to just build a secure enclave to secure it. That could be executed everywhere in the organization. Now, I've seen that. I've had these conversations recently with some other organizations. I try to, if you're building out net new, warn away from just building one enclave, putting the crown jewels specifically there. It's potentially a way of addressing risk quickly, but again, since we're not thinking through it holistically, there's just other gaps, other low-hanging the fruit in the environment that the threat actors will go after. So again, you're kind of just moving the cheese a little bit. And that's important, maybe from a compliance or a policy standpoint, but again, it's not making the entire organization safe. This methodology, at the end of the day, when executed effectively, defines everything in the organization. No trust. Thank you for your time. We're at time here. We'll let you get to your next sessions. Appreciate it.